The cry echoed through the frozen forest as young Leif, tears frozen on his cheeks, raised his fist toward the starry sky. Beside him, the old Skald Thorvald held his harp, his eyes fixed on the boy who was finally finding his voice after years of silence. "I will find her, even if I must cross the open sea," the boy vowed, while the Skald turned his sorrow into a song that would shake the heart of the hardest warrior. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of Vikings, where stories of pain, courage, and hope unfold. This channel is just beginning, and every subscription means the world to us. It helps keep these tales alive and brings us closer to our first 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy the story, please consider subscribing and sharing where you're watching from in the comments. Your support truly makes a difference. The dawn crept slowly over the jagged peaks surrounding Ravnfjord, casting pale light across a land gripped by the relentless breath of winter. A fragile mist hovered low over the frozen fjord waters, curling in delicate tendrils before fading into the cold morning air. The village itself lay nestled between towering pines, their branches heavy with snow that glittered faintly beneath the subdued sky. The scent of damp earth mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of the forge, visible from a distance where smoke twisted upward in thin, steady plumes. Leif Halvorsen stirred beneath the thick pelts that shielded him from the chill, his small frame curled tightly in the corner of the cramped cabin. The faintest whisper of wind sighed through the cracks in the wooden walls, a constant reminder of the world beyond his shelter, a world both harsh and unforgiving. His breath came out in shallow, visible puffs as he slowly opened his deep blue eyes, their icy hue reflecting the dim morning light. A faint scar traced over his left eyebrow, a mark from some forgotten scrape that seemed to echo the many small battles etched into his young life. At 12 years old, Leif bore the weight of loss heavier than most men twice his age. The absence of his mother, Sigrid Freysdottir, was a wound that never fully healed. He had lived with the quiet ache for 5 long winters since the Saxons had raided their village, tearing his family apart. His father, Halvor, a warrior of some renown, had fallen trying to save Sigrid from their captors. Now, with the man who had been both uncle and guardian, Gunnar, he shared a life marked by routine and silent grief. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and cold stone, the rough-hewn beams darkened by years of soot. Outside, a soft crunch echoed as Gunnar stepped onto the frozen ground, his sturdy boots pressing into the snow crust. The forge would soon awaken, as it did every morning, with the rhythmic pounding of hammer against anvil calling the village from its slumber. That sound was both comfort and torment to Leif. It reminded him of the life his father had lived, a life of strength and resilience, and the path his own might take. Ravnfjord was a place held at the mercy of nature's cruel hand. The days were short, the sun a weak, pale disk barely rising above the horizon before retreating again behind gray skies heavy with the threat of more snow. Frost clung to every surface, transforming each branch and stone into brittle sculpture. The cold bit at exposed skin with ruthless precision, and the wind carried whispers of old gods and forgotten battles. It was a land where silence held power, and the flicker of a candle's flame inside a mead hall could feel like a beacon of hope in an endless night. Leif's morning was one of quiet endurance. He pulled the fur tightly over his shoulders and rose, limbs stiff from the cold and the thin straw that served as his bed. The wooden floor beneath his feet was rough and uneven, worn smooth in some spots by years of footsteps. His fingers trembled slightly as he grasped the simple leather cord around his neck, a pendant of cold iron forged by his own inexperienced hand, a talisman and reminder of the strength he hoped to find one day. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the faint clatter of carts and footsteps echoed between timbered homes. The few villagers who remained after the raid lived quietly, their faces carved by hardship and the burdens of survival. Children skated cautiously across frozen ponds, their laughter muted by the weight of winter's shadow. The distant bleating of goats and the lowing of cattle reminded Leif of the fragile life that clung to these dark months. His first steps led him to the forge, the heart of Gunnar's world. The fairest scent of molten metal hung in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke that spiraled from the blackened chimney. Gunnar was already there, hunched over the anvil, the fiery glow of the furnace casting flickering shadows across his weathered face. His hands, calloused and powerful, moved with practiced precision, shaping glowing iron into tools and weapons that bore the soul of their maker. Leif watched silently. The steady rhythm of hammer strikes a balm to his restless mind. The clanging echoed not just through the forge but seemed to reverberate deep within his chest, awakening a fierce, unspoken longing. Each strike was a promise that strength could be forged, molded through pain and effort. Gunnar glanced up briefly, his dark eyes meeting Leif's. No words were spoken, but in that shared look was an unspoken understanding, a tether between them stronger than blood alone. Gunnar was a guardian, yes, but also a man shaped by grief and duty, carrying the weight of responsibility for the boy who was both his kin and his charge. Leif moved to gather coal, the rough black lumps cold and heavy in his hands. The chill seeped through his worn gloves, biting at fingers numb from the morning air. He carried the fuel carefully to the furnace, where the fire's warmth promised life and transformation. The flames roared hungrily as the coal fed the blaze, the orange glow licking at the cavernous hearth. As the forge brightened, so too did the sounds of the village grow louder. From the distance came the faint hammering of wooden pegs, the creak of wagons, the distant thud of axes biting into logs. Winter labor kept the people moving, their routines a steady cadence against the slow passage of days. Despite the life around him, Leif felt a profound solitude. His voice had long been subdued, swallowed by the vast silence that followed the raids and the loss of his family. Words were heavy, almost a betrayal of the pain tucked deep within. His gaze often drifted beyond the fjord, the dark waters stretching toward horizons he dared only dream of crossing. The open sea beckoned with both promise and peril, a realm where fate could be challenged and perhaps rewritten. Memories flickered like shadows in his mind. He saw his mother's face, her golden hair catching the light even in the darkest moments. He remembered the warmth of her hands, the gentle lullabies sung beneath the northern stars. Her small scar, like a crescent moon, was etched in his memory, a mark of resilience and love. Those memories were both a balm and a torment, sparking a fire that refused to be extinguished. The village elders often whispered of the gods watching from their halls in Asgard, of Odin's wisdom and Thor's fury. Leif clung to these stories, seeking strength in the ancient words, though doubt gnawed quietly at the edges of his faith. The gods seemed distant, unmoved by the suffering of a boy left behind. As the sun climbed higher, casting a faint glow over the frozen landscape, the rhythm of the village life unfolded. Men prepared for the day's hunt, sharpening blades and stacking supplies. Women tended fires and wove cloth, their hands deft and sure despite the biting cold. Children exchanged stories and dared one another to brave the ice. In the midst of this, Leif remained an island, caught between childhood and the harsh demands of his new reality. He sometimes touched the pendant at his throat, feeling the cold metal against his skin, a reminder that he must endure, that he must become something more than the sum of his losses. That morning offered little reprieve from the heavy silence inside him, but it was a day like any other, a day measured in the steady beat of hammer against anvil, the sharp scent of iron and fire, and the muted cries of a boy who carried the weight of hope and grief deep in his chest. Yet, even in this frozen stillness, the wind carried a faint, unfamiliar sound, a distant creak of a ship. The cold wind bit sharply as Leif and his small band made their cautious way along the jagged shoreline, the dark waters of the North Sea lapping silently against the rocks beneath their feet. The sun had barely risen, painting the horizon with thin streaks of pale orange that barely warmed the frozen earth. Each breath that escaped their lips hung in the air like fragile mist, a visible reminder of the harshness that awaited beyond the safety of Ravnfjord's familiar woods and fjords. Leif's fingers tightened around the hilt of the small sword Gunnar had given him, the cold metal biting into his palm through the worn leather grip. His eyes scanned the shadows between the skeletal trees, every crack of a twig or rustle of dry leaves setting his heart racing. Frida walked beside him, her shield strapped tightly to her arm, her green eyes sharp and alert as ever. Halvar and Eric moved like silent ghosts, their weapons sheathed but ready. The journey had been taxing. The biting cold seemed to seep deeper with every passing hour, gnawing at their resolve. But it was more than the weather that chilled Leif's spirit. It was the weight of uncertainty pressing upon him. The Skald's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. The image of his mother, worn and weary, yet unbroken, singing beneath distant stars in the lands of the Saxons. It felt both a promise and a torment. As the group crept forward, the forest began to thin, revealing a small clearing ahead. The ground was uneven, trampled as if by recent footsteps. Shadows clung to the edges, twisting in shapes that could be more than mere trees. Leif's breath caught. There was a faint sound carried on the wind, a soft, desperate whimper. "Did you hear that?" Leif whispered, barely moving his lips. Frida nodded, her hand tightening on her shield's rim. "Someone's close, possibly in trouble." The others paused, the silence that followed almost unbearable, broken only by the faint whimpers that grew clearer, childlike, fragile, trembling. Leif's heart pounded fiercely against his ribs. His mind raced with memories of his own pain, his silent suffering through years of loss and fear. Now, faced with the sound of another in distress, a choice lay before him. Press on toward his own desperate quest, or stop to aid this mysterious voice crying out in the wilderness. The others looked to him, their expressions unreadable but expectant. Though young, Leif felt the mantle of leadership settle heavily on his shoulders. He took a cautious step forward, then another, until the tangled underbrush parted enough to reveal a small figure huddled against the base of a twisted pine. The child was no more than 7 or 8, clothed in ragged scraps of cloth that did little to stave off the cold. His hair was matted and dirty, eyes wide and glassy with fear, cheeks stained with tears freezing on his skin. Leif felt a pang of recognition, not of the boy himself, but of the raw, vulnerable helplessness he carried. It was a mirror of his own childhood, magnified by years of silence and isolation. "Do not be afraid," Leif said gently, lowering himself to sit a short distance away, careful not to startle the child. "Who are you? How did you come to be here alone?" The boy blinked, his lips trembling. I ran," he whispered, voice barely audible. "The Saxons, they took my family. I escaped, but they are coming." Fear gripped Leif's heart. He knew too well the terror of being hunted, the endless dread of capture and loss. The boy's story was a shadow of his own nightmare. Frida crouched beside Leif, her gaze scanning the tree line. "We must move quickly. If they are near, this clearing won't stay safe for long." Leif swallowed hard, the weight of responsibility settling over him like a mantle. Here was a child, defenseless, terrified, a life he could not simply turn away from. Yet, every step he took toward helping this boy meant greater risk for himself and his companions. The path to his mother would grow more dangerous still. "Can you walk?" Leif asked softly. The boy nodded, though his legs trembled. "Then you will come with us," Leif declared, rising slowly. "We protect our own." The boy's eyes flickered with a mix of hope and disbelief, and for a brief moment, Leaf saw something in those frightened depths, a flicker of trust, fragile but real. As they moved away from the clearing, Leaf glanced back one last time. The forest seemed to close behind them, swallowing the shadows and secrets alike. The boy, now clutching Leaf's hand tightly, leaned on him as they pressed forward, a silent reminder that the journey was no longer his alone. Night fell early, the sky darkening to a deep indigo as a fierce wind swept through the trees. Around the flickering flames of their small campfire, the group huddled close, the boy wrapped in a spare cloak that Gunnar had produced from his pack. Leaf sat beside him, tracing the outline of a faded rune carved into the boy's wooden talisman, a symbol of protection. "Tell me your name," Leaf urged softly. The boy looked up, hesitation lingering. "Eirik," he finally said, voice barely above a whisper. Eirik's presence weighed heavily on Leaf's thoughts. Each moment spent with the boy peeled back layers of his own pain, reminding him that his mother's suffering was not isolated but part of a crueler, wider world. The boy's trembling hands, the haunted look in his eyes, stirred a fierce protectiveness that burned hot beneath Leaf's quiet exterior. Thorvald's voice, carried in memory, returned to him like a steady beacon. The courage to help others, even when it costs you everything, that is the mark of the true warrior. But doubt not at Leaf in the dark. Could he afford this new burden? Could he lead a child through hostile lands, when even he was unsure of his own strength? The shadows of fear tugged at his resolve, whispering caution, pleading for safety over sacrifice. Yet as the flames danced and cast flickering light on Eirik's fragile face, Leaf made his choice. "We do this together," he vowed quietly to the boy and to himself. Morning came heavy with fog, seeping into the bones like a slow chill that refused to thaw. The group prepared to move, the weight of their mission pressing onward. Gunnar checked weapons with practiced hands while Frida adjusted the straps on her shield, her jaw set and determined. Halvar and Eirik packed provisions, their faces grim but resolute. Leaf knelt beside Eirik, tying the boy's worn boots tighter. "We face dangers neither of us yet understand," he said softly. "But we will keep you safe." Eirik nodded, eyes wide but steady. The child's presence transformed the journey from a solitary quest into a shared burden, and a fragile hope that pain could be met with courage. They set out once more, the narrow path winding through a tangled thicket toward the lands where Saxon banners were said to fly. Each step carried the weight of uncertainty, yet beneath it all, a quiet determination grew, a thread of resolve that bound them together in the face of shadow and fear. As the frozen sea whispered dark secrets beyond the shore, Leaf understood that this moment, the choice to protect another in need, would define not just his journey, but the man he was becoming. Every step forward was a defiance of despair. Every breath taken in the bitter air was a silent promise. No one would be left behind. Not again. The forest held its breath as the small group moved cautiously beneath the skeletal branches, their footsteps muffled by a blanket of fresh snow. The bitter wind had died down, leaving a heavy silence that seemed to press against their skins like the cold itself. Leaf walked with quiet purpose, his hand still clutching the fragile fingers of young Eirik. The boy's grip was weak but desperate, as if letting go meant surrendering to the darkness that had chased him this far. The journey from the clearing to the village was shorter than it had felt in their minds, yet every step carried the weight of uncertainty. The trees began to thin, and the outline of familiar roofs and the distant flicker of hearth fires came into view. Ravnfjord. The village, though small and worn by hardship, promised warmth and shelter, something Eirik had known little of for too long. Leaf's heart quickened as they approached the cluster of wooden homes, their rough timbers darkened by years of rain and smoke. The smell of burning wood and cooking meat wafted through the air, mingling with the crisp scent of pine and snow. It was a scent that stirred a strange mix of comfort and pain in him, a reminder of what he had lost, and what he might still protect. Gunnar with Leif sat near, watching closely. His own hands, hardened from years of work, trembled slightly as he reached into his pack for a small cloth bundle Gunnar had prepared, a mixture of herbs and salves for wounds. He could feel the sting of the boy's cold hands as they reached for the warmth of the fire, fingers trembling like fragile branches in a storm. The silence in the cabin was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with tentative trust, with unspoken understanding. Leif's gaze met Eirik's several times, each exchange a fragile bridge between two souls scarred by pain, yet seeking connection. Eirik's eyes flickered with recognition as Leif gently cleaned a shallow cut on his forearm. The boy's breath caught, and for a moment, the language barrier softened. His tongue slipped out to wet his cracked lips, and a low, guttural word escaped, Saxon, the foreign tongue of his captors. Leif caught the fragment, but said nothing, simply nodding in acknowledgement. There was no need for words. The shared weight of suffering spoke louder than any language. As Gunnar prepared a simple meal, coarse bread soaked in broth and dried fish, Leif carefully helped Eirik to sit up. The boy's body was frail, shrunken from hunger and cold, but his spirit flickered stubbornly beneath the surface. When Leif offered the food, Eirik hesitated, then accepted with trembling hands, eating slowly as if afraid the warmth might disappear. Frida remained near, her presence steady and protective. She reached out once to brush a tangle of dirty hair from the boy's forehead, her touch gentle yet firm, an unspoken promise that here, at least, there was safety. Leif felt a swell of something unfamiliar rise within him, an urgency to shield this child from the darkness that had already stolen so much. Yet beneath that fierce protectiveness was an aching tenderness, the recognition of shared pain and the fragile hope that healing might begin in this quiet cabin. Hours passed as night deepened outside, the fire's glow casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Eirik's breath grew steadier, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Leif sat nearby, the small sword resting against the wall beside him, forgotten for a time as the boy finally succumbed to sleep. In the dim light, Leif traced the outline of the wooden talisman around Eirik's neck, a crude carving of a raven, worn smooth by time and wear. The symbol stirred something deep within Leif, a silent echo of the gods who watched over travelers and lost souls alike. He wondered briefly about the boy's past, the family torn from him, the silent nights spent hiding in fear. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, mournful song, the memory of distant lands and broken lives. But here, in the warmth of the cabin, there was a fragile peace, a space where two broken children, bound by loss and uncertainty, could begin to rebuild the shattered pieces of their souls. Leif's thoughts drifted to his mother, Sigrid, whose golden hair and crescent scar haunted his dreams. He imagined her voice, singing beneath foreign stars, reaching across the sea and time. And now, with Eirik by his side, the journey felt less like a solitary burden and more like a shared path, illuminated by the faint glow of hope. As his eyes closed, Leif felt the weight of the day lift slightly, replaced by a quiet resolve. Tomorrow would bring dangers and decisions he could not yet foresee. But in this moment, there was only the steady beat of a heart beginning to trust again, and the promise that even in the coldest winter, warmth could be found in the smallest of gestures. The night deepened, and the cabin settled into silence. Outside, stars winked through the darkening sky, silent witnesses to a story still unfolding, a story of pain, courage, and the fragile threads of human connection that could bind even the most broken souls. The wind shifted suddenly, a sharp gust cutting through the heavy silence of the village as if nature itself were signaling a change, a warning carried on cold breath. Leif stood at the edge of Ravnfjord, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the dark line of sea met the pale sky. The faint crunch of footsteps behind him drew his attention. Gunnar approached, his face grave beneath the heavy brow. The blacksmith's hands, once steady and sure in the forge, now trembled slightly as he folded his arms tightly across his chest. "They know," Gunnar said simply, his voice low but edged with tension. "Word has spread beyond the fjord. Our secret is no longer ours alone." Leif's throat tightened. The boy who had silently borne his grief for years now faced a new reality. The fragile hope of rescue already threatened by the weight of the world outside their small sanctuary. The shadows of the Saxon lands they sought to cross were no longer distant threats whispered in the dark. They were close, tangible, and closing fast. It began with the travelers. Merchants who sailed from distant ports, long familiar with the tides and trade routes, carried rumors on their tongues like poison. Whispers of a boy from Ravnfjord who had slipped away with a band of warriors, a boy with fire in his eyes and a cause that stirred unrest. The Saxon lords, already wary of Viking raids, caught wind of a possible rescue attempt, an act that could ignite old hostilities and blood debts. News spread like wildfire, carried on the backs of ravens and hurried riders. The neighboring clans, long simmering with their own grudges against Ravnfjord, saw opportunity in the turmoil. Some sent scouts cloaked in shadow, others sent warnings wrapped in threats. The fragile peace of the village, once protected by distance and cold, began to crack beneath the weight of suspicion and fear. At the mead hall, where the villagers gathered to share warmth and stories against the relentless winter, conversations grew hushed and urgent. Faces that once bore quiet acceptance now flickered with distrust. Gunnar's presence at Leif's side was both comfort and a reminder of the dangers ahead. Frida paced the length of the hall, her sharp eyes catching every glance, every whispered word. "They watch us," she said without looking up. "Not just the Saxons, our own neighbors. They fear what this could bring." Leif remained silent, his fingers clenched tightly around the small sword at his side. The weight of responsibility pressed down harder than the bitter cold outside. The boy who had once spoken only in silence now found himself caught between the fierce desire to protect and the harsh reality of a world that demanded sacrifice. That evening, as the long shadows stretched across the frozen earth, a sudden knock at the door shattered the fragile calm. Gunnar opened it to reveal a messenger, a rider wrapped in furs stained with ice and dirt, his breath ragged from the journey. In his hand, a sealed parchment bore the mark of a rival clan, the jagged emblem of the Jarl of Hrafnheim. The message was clear and uncompromising. Cease your actions or face the wrath of those who guard the borders of Saxon lands. The boy's fate is not yours to decide. Let him go, or bring disaster upon Ravnfjord. The room fell silent, the threat hanging in the air like a blade poised to strike. Gunnar's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening. "They think to bully us with words," he growled. "But words have no power without steel to back them." Leif felt the fire flicker within him, the same fire that had driven him to take up the sword, to seek his mother against all odds. But now, that fire was tempered by doubt, by the knowledge that every step forward risked not just his own life, but the safety of those who had dared to stand with him. The next days were filled with tension thick enough to choke. Scouts returned with warnings of increased patrols near the fjord's mouth. Traders spoke of Saxon warbands gathering, their banners like dark flames against the snow. The village elders debated fiercely, torn between fear and loyalty, their voices raised and broken with emotion. Leif found himself often alone beneath the ancient pines, the silence around him heavy with questions. Could he protect Eirik, the boy whose frightened eyes mirrored his own past? Could he shield his mother's name from the wrath of clans hardened by years of conflict? The weight of these choices threatened to crush the fragile hope he clung to. One night, Thorvald approached quietly, his harp slung across his back, eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. Settling beside Leif, The old Skald's voice was low. Leif met the man's gaze, his own steady despite the storm inside. "I seek only to bring my mother home," he said quietly. "Is that such a crime?" The crowd murmured, voices rising and falling like the restless sea. Some nodded in reluctant understanding. Others shook their heads, fear twisting their expressions. Gunnar stepped forward, his voice rising over the clamor. "This boy carries more courage than most men. He fights not for glory, but for family. If that brings danger, then so be it. We stand with him." The tension crackled like lightning, but Gunnar's words settled over the crowd like a shield. Slowly, the murmurs softened, wary respect rubbing against the edges of doubt. Still, threats came in the night. Fires set at the edges of the village, shadows glimpsed beyond the tree line, the silent approach of scouts watching and waiting. The warning was clear. The price of hope was a battle yet to come. Leif's nights grew restless. He lay awake beneath his furs, listening to the wind's mournful cries, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. His dreams were filled with the faces of those he loved and those he had lost, a tapestry of pain and strength weaving through the darkness. In the cold dawn, Thorvald's song would sometimes drift through the village, a lament carried on harp strings. It was a reminder that even in the face of despair, stories lived on, stories that could inspire, that could bind a fractured people in the face of storm. On the edge of the village, Leif found Eirik, now steadier but still fragile, watching the pale light with quiet eyes. The boy's small hand slipped into Leif's, a silent pact forged in the frost. "We must be ready," Leif whispered, "for whatever comes." Eirik nodded, the weight of fear softened by trust. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by threats both seen and unseen. But in that moment, beneath the gray sky and among the trembling trees, a spark burned. A spark of defiance against the cold, against the darkness, against the silence that had kept them apart. The world outside Ravnfjord had taken notice. The boy who wept for his mother no longer hid in shadows. He stood at the cusp of a reckoning, his heart a battleground where pain and courage met. And the story of his journey, whispered by the old Skald, would soon be sung in voices that reached far beyond the frozen fjord. In the gathering storm, Leif understood that the greatest battle was not just for survival, but for the right to hope, to save those who could not save themselves, to defy the weight of a world bent on crushing him. The cold was relentless, the dangers multiplied, but beneath it all, a quiet truth endured. Sometimes, the smallest light shines brightest in the darkest night. The morning air was thick with an uneasy stillness, as if the very land itself held its breath beneath a heavy, gray sky. The village of Ravnfjord lay shrouded in frost, the usual crispness of winter subdued by the weight of impending darkness. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, but the warmth of hearth fires did little to thaw the cold tension that gripped the hearts of its people. The familiar sounds of daily life, the clatter of tools, the chatter of neighbors, were muted, replaced by whispered fears and hurried preparations. Leif stood at the edge of the village, the harsh wind tugging at the worn cloak draped over his shoulders. His breath came in steady, visible puffs, each exhale a fragile cloud against the cold. His eyes, sharp and blue as ever, scanned the horizon where the dense forest gave way to a swath of open ground, the stretch of moor that separated Ravnfjord from the wider world beyond. It was a place they had long counted on for warning, a buffer against any who might approach with ill intent. Today, it was a front line. Behind him, the low murmur of voices rose from the heart of the village. Gunnar's heavy footsteps approached, steady and sure despite the burden of leadership pressing down on him. The blacksmith's face was drawn tight, shadows under his eyes deepened by sleepless nights and unspoken worries. He carried himself like a man preparing for war, muscles taut beneath his worn leather tunic, hands clenched in quiet resolve. "They're coming," Gunnar said without preamble, voice low and grim. The scouts saw their banners at dawn. Not far now. Leif swallowed hard. The men who had sent the messenger days before were no idle threats. The Jarl of Hrafnheim's forces were marching toward Ravnfjord, their intent clear and unforgiving. The boy who had once been silent now felt the weight of the entire village settling on his young shoulders. This was no longer a mere rescue mission. It had become a fight for survival. Frida appeared beside them, her green eyes sharp as winter ice, her hand resting lightly on the rim of her shield. "We've prepared as best we can," she said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "But they outnumber us. It won't be an easy dawn." Leif nodded, his gaze drifting to the small sword at his side. The blade felt heavier today, not from its weight, but from the burden of what it represented, a promise to protect, a pledge to fight for those he loved. He flexed his fingers around the hilt, breathing in the cold air to steady the storm inside. The village bell tolled, deep, sonorous, a call to arms that echoed through the frosted streets. One by one, men and women gathered, faces etched with determination and dread. Old warriors took their place beside young fighters. Children were ushered to safe corners, and the sick and elderly were moved to the stoutest shelters. The cold steel of axes and spears gleamed dully in the pale light. Raised shields bore the scratched symbols of protection, and the air pulsed with a raw, electric anticipation. As the villagers prepared, Leif found himself drawn to the small cabin where Eirik sat quietly by the hearth. The boy's wide eyes met his, reflecting a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Leif knelt beside him, gripping the child's shoulder gently. "Stay close," he whispered. "No matter what happens, we protect each other." Eirik's nod was barely perceptible, but the trust in that simple gesture anchored Leif's resolve. He rose, swallowing the lump of anxiety lodged tight in his throat. This was the moment where all that pain, all those years of silent suffering, would either shatter or be reforged in fire. Outside the village, the first dark shapes emerged from the tree line. Flags bearing the jagged emblem of Hrafnheim fluttered against the bleak sky, and the steady drum of war horns rolled over the frozen ground like a distant storm. The enemy was close now, their intent made clear by the formality of their advance, a calculated show of force meant to intimidate and break the spirit before swords were even drawn. At the village edge, Gunnar stepped forward to meet the approaching throng. His voice rang out, strong yet measured. "You come to threaten those who seek no quarrel beyond the safety of their homes. Speak your demands, or turn back." A figure detached itself from the enemy ranks, a tall man clad in dark leather and chainmail, his face shadowed beneath a helm adorned with iron spikes. His gaze was cold, sharp as a blade, and his presence radiated authority. This was Jarl Sigurd Hrafnheim, rival, judge, and the voice of the Saxon lords whose lands lay to the south. The man's lips curled into a thin, merciless smile. "I am here to end your folly." Sigurd's voice cut through the chill air, carrying over the tense silence like a blade slicing through cloth. "You harbor fugitives. You defy the will of those who hold power in the south. Release the boy and his companions, or suffer the consequences." Leif stepped forward, heart pounding fiercely but unyielding. The village had gathered behind him, a wall of resolve and fear intertwined. His voice, though young, carried the weight of years spent in silent longing. "I do not seek war, but I will not abandon my own to slavery and chains. My mother is held captive, and I will bring her home, even if it costs me my life." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces filled with admiration, others with fear. Gunnar's hand rested briefly on Leif's shoulder, a silent show of solidarity and strength. Jarl Sigurd's eyes narrowed. "Bold words for a boy. Do you understand what you risk? The wrath of lords and clans beyond your village? The lives of all who stand with you." His gaze flicked over the assembled villagers, daring them to show weakness. Leif met the challenge without flinching. I understand. But the first clash was sudden and brutal, the sound of steel ringing against steel, the thud of bodies meeting in desperate struggle. Leif thrust his blade forward, feeling the shock of impact surge through his arm. His breaths came harsh and ragged in the cold air, the taste of iron sharp on his tongue. Around him, the village fought with fierce desperation. Gunnar's hammer met enemy steel with the sound of thunder, Frida's shield blocked and struck with precise fury. Leif moved like a shadow, his youthful strength bolstered by pure, burning will. Every strike carried the hope of rescue, every parry the weight of loss. Amid the chaos, the enemy pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming. Leif caught a flash of Jarl Sigurd moving like a specter through the fray, a relentless force seeking to break the lines. The boy's heart thundered as he locked eyes with the Jarl. This was the moment, the test of his courage, the crucible where fate would be forged. With a cry that echoed through the storm of battle, Leif charged forward, sword raised, a spark of defiance ablaze in his gaze. The clash that followed was not just of steel but of wills, between a boy's desperate hope and a man's cold ambition. Time seemed to slow as their blades met in a shower of sparks, the world shrinking to the rhythm of their fight. Leif felt the sting of pain, the burn of exertion, but found strength in every breath, every heartbeat. Around them, the battle raged on, a tempest of cries, sweat, and blood. Yet within that violent storm, a quiet truth shone bright. The courage of one could kindle the spirit of many. As the fight drew on, the village rallied, inspired by Leif's unyielding stand. Their opponents staggered, uncertainty creeping into their ranks. Jarl Sigurd's fury blazed, but even he faltered before the unbreakable will of a boy fighting for his mother, for family, for the fragile hope of reunion. The clash reached its peak, a desperate gamble where the line between victory and ruin blurred beneath the cold sky. And as the first light of dawn pierced the clouds, bathing the battlefield in pale gold, the cry that rose from the heart of Ravnfjord was not just one of battle, but of a fierce, unyielding promise, that love, even when forged in silence and tears, could shatter the darkest chains and light the path forward. The first light of dawn spilled hesitantly over the frost-laden fields surrounding Ravnfjord, painting the world in pale shades of silver and blue. The village lay quiet, its inhabitants still locked in the uneasy calm that follows the storm of battle. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, but now it carried no acrid bitterness. Only the scent of burning wood meant to warm, not to destroy. Everywhere, the traces of conflict lingered, broken shields discarded in the snow, trampled earth where men had fought and fallen, and the quiet groans of those tending wounds by flickering fires. Leif stood at the edge of the village, the small sword at his side catching the faint light as he looked out toward the horizon. The weight on his chest had shifted, not lifted entirely, but transformed. Where once had been only pain and anger, there now stirred something fragile yet undeniable, a thread of hope. Beside him, Gunnar's voice broke the silence, low and steady. You fought with the heart of a warrior, Leif. More than that, you fought like a son fighting for his mother. Gunnar's hand rested briefly on Leif's shoulder, a gesture heavy with pride and unspoken apology for all the years lost. Leif's eyes were distant. The battle had taken more than his strength, it had carved deep into his soul. Yet beneath the exhaustion, beneath the ache, lay a fierce light. He had faced down death itself and emerged not just alive, but changed. Hardened, yes, but also redeemed. They will come again, Leif said quietly, voice rough but resolute. But this time, we will be ready. His gaze dropped to the snowy ground, tracing the faint footprints left by those who had fallen. Not just for me, or for my mother, but for all of us. The village stirred as people emerged from their shelters, cautious but alive. Among them was Frida, her face marked with streaks of soot and exhaustion, but shining with a fierce determination. She approached Leif and Gunnar, the shield at her back now dented but still unbroken. "Our enemies have tasted the strength of Ravensfjord," she said, voice steady despite the weariness. "They know we will not surrender." The day unfolded slowly, the village coming to life amid the wreckage left behind. The smithy's forge was rekindled, the rhythmic pounding of hammer on anvil a song of resilience. Women and men moved through the streets, tending to wounds, repairing broken fences, and gathering food. The air, though still cold, carried a sense of renewal, a quiet promise that life would press on. Leif found himself walking toward the mead hall, the hearth of the community. Inside, the familiar warmth greeted him like an old friend, but it was the faces around the fire that held his attention. There, seated near the flickering flames, was Eirik, the boy who had become more than just a companion on this perilous journey. His eyes met Leif's, and in that glance was a shared understanding, a bond forged in hardship and hope. As Leif sat beside the boy, Thorvald's voice rose softly in the background, the old Skald's harp weaving a gentle melody that seemed to stitch together the frayed edges of their spirits. The song was one of sorrow, yes, but also of healing, a balm for wounds both seen and unseen. The villagers gathered closer, drawn by the music and the quiet strength that radiated from the young boy who had once wept alone in the frozen forest. In their eyes, Leif was no longer just a child marked by loss. He was a symbol of endurance, a spark of light in the long, dark winter. Among the crowd, Gunnar rose, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in silent mourning. "We have lost much," he said, "but today we have gained something greater. A reminder that even in the darkest times, the bonds of family and friendship hold fast." A murmur of agreement spread through the hall. Old grudges softened beneath the warmth of shared experience. The whispers of suspicion that had threatened to divide the village faded, replaced by a collective resolve to stand together. Leif's heart swelled as he looked around. The faces that had once seemed shadowed by fear now shone with cautious hope. He thought of his mother, Sigrid, whose voice had reached him across the seas in the Skald's song. The knowledge that she lived, that she endured, was a beacon that guided him through the darkest nights. Later, as the evening shadows lengthened, a figure approached the gathering, a woman cloaked in simple but sturdy garb, her golden hair catching the firelight. Her eyes, when they met Leif's, held the same fierce dignity and warmth he remembered from his mother's face. It was a moment suspended in time, a reunion forged not in grandeur, but in the quiet recognition of shared pain and unbroken love. Sigrid's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke, her words simple but weighty. "My son, you came for me." Leif's breath caught, the years of silence and sorrow breaking like a dam. "I will always come," he replied, voice thick with tears. "No matter how far, no matter the cost." Around them, the village watched, the circle of life and loss closing gently. The fragile peace that had been won was a testament to the power of courage and compassion, forces that no blade could sever. As night deepened and the stars blinked awake, Thorvald's harp sang one last time, a melody of redemption, of healing, and of a future shaped not by chains or silence, but by the unyielding strength of love. Leif knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger. The Saxon lands still held shadows, and the wounds of war were slow to heal. But in that moment, surrounded by those who had stood with him, he felt a quiet certainty. The boy who had wept alone was no longer silent. His voice had become a song, a saga not just of loss, but of hope reborn, and a promise that no matter how dark the night, dawn would come. The morning light filtered softly through the frost-laced window panes of the small cabin, casting long, tender shadows across the worn wooden floor. Inside, the air was quiet, touched only by the gentle crackle of the dying embers nestled in the hearth. "You bear the mark of a warrior," Gunnar said quietly, settling down beside the boys. His voice held no boast, only the honest truth of a man who had seen much and still found reason to believe. "Not just by strength of arm, but by the courage of your heart." He looked at Leif, the boy who had once been silent, now speaking through his deeds. "Ravnfjord is proud of you." Leif met his uncle's gaze, the years of silent pain giving way to a faint but certain smile. "I could not have done it without you," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of unspoken gratitude. "Nor without Frida, Halvar, Eric, and the Skald's song guiding us." Outside, the village was already beginning to stir with new purpose. The wounds of the recent storm were still fresh, scars in the earth, in the timbers of homes, and in the hearts of its people. But beneath the surface, a quiet transformation was underway. The fearful whispers that had shadowed the frozen streets were giving way to cautious hopes, and the once fractured community found itself drawn toward an unspoken reconciliation. In the mead hall, where once suspicion had brewed like a gathering storm, the villagers now gathered in smaller, more earnest circles. Old grudges softened beneath the warmth of shared stories and the lingering power of Thorvald's harp. The Skald's melodies, once mournful, now carried notes of resilience and renewal, reminders that even the deepest wounds could begin to knit together beneath the steady hands of time and courage. Frida stood near the fire, her shield resting against the worn wooden bench. Her green eyes scanned the faces around her, not with the sharp vigilance of a warrior on guard, but with the softer gaze of one who had borne witness to change. She had become more than a protector. She was a symbol of the village's renewed spirit, a bridge between the past's pain and the promise of days yet to come. "Ravnfjord is no longer just a refuge," she said quietly to a neighbor beside her. "It is a place where wounds are met with strength, and where those who suffer are not forgotten." The old Skald, Thorvald, sat in the corner, his harp resting across his knees. His weathered face held a serene smile, the lines of age softened by the satisfaction of a story well told and a song that had found its voice. His eyes, ever watchful, rested on Leif as the boy moved through the crowd, a quiet hero carrying the weight of his own saga. In the days that followed, the fabric of village life wove itself anew. The forge's fires burned brighter, not just fueled by coal, but by the renewed hope in hearts that had once been shadowed by despair. Gunnar's hammer rang out over Ravnfjord, not as a call to arms, but as a song of creation, shaping tools and weapons not just for war, but for rebuilding and protection. Leif found himself drawn again and again to the forge, his hands steady as he worked alongside his uncle. The rhythm of hammer and anvil no longer echoed with silent rage, but with quiet determination, a forging not just of iron, but of self. One morning, as the frost began to thaw and the first tentative shoots of spring pushed through the snow, Leif stood outside the forge, gazing toward the sea that had carried him so far from home and back again. His thoughts were a tangle of memories, his mother's voice, the Skald's song, the faces of those he had journeyed with, and those who had waited in silence. Sigrid had returned with the first thaw, her presence a light that cut through the long winter of their souls. She moved among the villagers with a quiet dignity, her golden hair still catching the sun, her blue eyes steady and full of stories etched by hardship yet unbroken. The scars she carried, like the small crescent moon on her wrist, were marks not of defeat, but of survival. Her reunion with Leif had been simple, stripped of grand gestures, yet profound in its honesty. There was no need for words that could not capture the depth of their shared loss and love. In their embrace, the years of silence dissolved, replaced by a bond forged anew in the fire of hope and the enduring strength of family. In the days that followed, Sigrid took up her place within the village once more, not as a shadow cast by captivity, but as a vital thread in the community's fabric. Her songs, soft, haunting melodies carried from the lands of the Saxons, wove through the halls of Ravensfjord, a testament to a resilience that transcended borders and chains. Leif often sat beside her in the evenings, listening as her voice rose beneath the northern stars. The melodies spoke of journeys both cruel and beautiful, of tears shed and courage found. In those moments, the boy who had once wept alone found strength not just in vengeance or rescue, but in the quiet power of shared stories and enduring love. Yet the journey was far from over. The world beyond Ravensfjord remained vast and uncertain, shadowed by old rivalries and new dangers. Some among the village whispered of future raids, of enemies lurking beyond the forests, waiting for weakness to falter. But the village stood stronger now, bound by a shared purpose and the unyielding will to protect those they held dear. Frida, now a trusted leader among the warriors, trained new recruits with fierce dedication. Her shield was never far from her side, her gaze always sharp but tempered by the wisdom born in battle and loss. She became a guardian not just of Ravensfjord's walls, but of its spirit, an emblem of the village's resolve to face whatever storms might come. Eirik, too, grew under the watchful eyes of the community. The boy who had once trembled in the shadows was blossoming, his fears slowly unspooling beneath the gentle care of those who refused to let him fade into silence. Under Leif's quiet guidance, Eirik found strength in the stories of their people, in the runes carved by Thorvald, and in the unspoken promise of family. One crisp morning, as the sun rose high and the village bustled with renewed life, a ship set sail from Ravensfjord's harbor. Its sails caught the wind with steady resolve, carrying a lone figure toward new horizons. It was Thorvald, the Skald, whose restless spirit had always been drawn to the road less traveled. His departure was quiet but meaningful, a reminder that stories never truly end, but continue to unfold with every step taken beyond the familiar. Before leaving, the old Skald approached Leif, his gray eyes warm with unspoken blessings. "The world awaits your song, young wolf," he said softly. "Carry your pain, your hope, and your courage with you. Let them guide your path, as they have guided mine." Leif nodded, the echo of the Skald's words settling deep within him. "I will," he promised. "And when the time comes, I will sing our story." As the ship disappeared beyond the horizon, the village gathered once more beneath the vast northern sky. The stars blinked awake, silent witnesses to the cycles of life and the endless dance of loss and renewal. Fires burned bright in the mead halls, their glow a beacon against the lingering cold, a symbol that even in the darkest seasons, light endures. Leif stood at the edge of the gathering, his hand resting lightly on Eirik's shoulder. Together, they faced the future, not as broken children of a cruel fate, but as bearers of a legacy forged in sorrow and strength. His voice, once silenced by grief, had become a song, a saga of hope that would echo through the ages. The story of a boy who wept for his mother, found his voice in the darkness, and inspired a village to rise. And as the night deepened, the wind carried a faint melody through the pines, a song of healing, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of family. It was a song that would be sung again and again, wherever hearts dared to remember that even in silence and tears, the light of love could never be extinguished. The fire's glow settled into a gentle warmth, casting long shadows that flickered across the worn wooden walls of the mead hall. The murmurs of the villagers had quieted, giving way to a stillness that felt both fragile and profound. Outside, the cold night pressed in, but within these walls, something enduring had taken root, a shared breath of hope and the slow, steady pulse of healing. Leif sat quietly near the fire, his gaze distant yet steady. The battles fought, the dangers faced, and the losses borne had left marks deeper than any wound on skin. Yet, beneath the scarred surface of his soul, outside the hall, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the soft rustle of ancient leaves and the faint echo of distant waves against rocky shores. The night sky stretched wide and unyielding, a canvas dotted with stars that had watched over generations before him. Among their cold light, the past and future seemed to intertwine, a reminder that the stories of pain and courage were never truly finished, but passed down like sacred fire. Thorvald, the old Skald, leaned back against a wooden pillar, his harp resting quietly in his lap. His weathered face bore the calm of one who knew the weight of stories, how they could wound, heal, and inspire. His eyes met Leif's briefly, a silent benediction exchanged between storyteller and the living saga. As the night deepened, the villagers began to drift toward their homes, their footsteps softened by fresh snow. The quiet that followed was not one of resignation, but of contemplation, a moment suspended between what had been lost and what might still be found. Leif rose, stepping outside into the crisp night air. The sky was a deep ink black, punctured by the sharp glitter of stars. He drew his cloak tighter, the cold biting at his skin, but failing to reach the fire kindling within his chest. He thought about the long road ahead, the uncertain horizons beyond Ravnfjord, the lingering shadows of Saxon lands, and the challenges yet to come. Yet, for the first time in many winters, the future looked less like a storm and more like a path waiting to be walked. Turning his gaze toward the distant sea, Leif whispered a vow to the night, that no matter how far the journey stretched, no matter how fierce the trials, he would carry the courage born of his silent tears, the strength forged in the fires of loss, and the unyielding hope that had awakened in his heart. Behind him, the faint sound of a harp began to rise on the wind, a melody both sorrowful and defiant, echoing through the pines and over frozen waters. It was Thorvald's song, weaving the threads of their tale into the endless tapestry of the north. In that moment, beneath the vast, indifferent sky, Leif understood what the old Skald had long known, that the greatest battles are not always fought with sword and shield, but with the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The boy who had once wept alone was now a bearer of light, a living saga whispered across the fjords and forests, reminding all who would listen that even in the deepest darkness, the flames of love and courage endure. And so, under the watchful gaze of the gods and stars, the story continued, not as an end, but as an invitation. An invitation to remember that the power to change destiny lies within the heart that refuses to be silenced. If this journey has stirred something within you, then join us in the next chapter, where the echoes of the past continue to shape the courage of those who walk the path ahead. Because every saga begins with a single voice, and every voice deserves to be heard.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.